This morning we are on to part 5 of our series on the Unitarian Universalist 7 principles, affirming the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. As we've already been exposed to this morning, we see that there is an inherent tension in this principle. It is an intentional tension, if you will, and hopefully a creative one as well. It is a tension that actually runs through all of our principles, perhaps most obvious at the poles, when we contrast the ideals and values embedded in our first principle and the ideals and values of our 7th principle. The tension, just to cut to the chase, is between the rights and needs of the individual as contrasted with the rights and needs of the greater community. By highlighting both the right of conscience, an idea that elevates the individual, and the democratic process, an idea that elevates the community, the 5th principle represents our conscious attempt to recognize the tension created by these competing values and our unyielding hope that the two can live in harmony together and in balance. And indeed, they must, if we are to accomplish the other aspirational goals we have laid out for ourselves in our other principles, including the incarnation of such sacred ideals as justice, equity, compassion, liberty, and peace. It should come as no surprise that the difficulty we face as a faith in grappling with these ideas parallels the difficulty faced by our entire nation. So much of the history of our UU faith is intertwined with the history of this nation, and we will talk more about that a bit later. But this dichotomy, the individual versus the community, is one that America and all freedom-loving people have been struggling with for centuries. Let us start with that odd phrase, the right of conscience. Now, historically and legally, the right of conscience is often associated with freedom of thought and freedom of belief. It has been argued, and rightfully so, that the right or freedom of conscience is the bedrock upon which many of our other most cherished rights and freedoms are grounded and anchored. In the colonial era and the early days of our nation, one of the most important apologists for this right of conscience was a preacher by the name of the Reverend John Leland. Leland was a fascinating character of history who does not receive the kind of recognition he rightfully deserves. He was a Baptist minister who was decades, actually maybe centuries, ahead of his time. He was a vocal abolitionist. He also railed against the idea of America being a Christian nation. Consider this quote: "The notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever. Government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely, and see that one does not abuse another. The liberty I contend for is more than toleration. The very idea of toleration is despicable. It supposes that some have a preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence, whereas all should be equally free, Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christians." Leland said that in 1790. Are you kidding me? This guy should be a UU. That'll preach today. Can we trade someone to the Baptist to get the rights to this guy? Like, we'll get Leland, MLK in a package deal. I don't know exactly who we'd have to give up. I have a couple of names, but that's a good question for y'all to discuss at social hour today. Leland also famously delivered a giant piece of cheese weighing over half a ton to then President Thomas Jefferson. I am not making this up. Leland, who remember was an ardent abolitionist, made explicitly sure that no slaves participated in the making of this cheese. So it was slave-free cheese presented to President Thomas Jefferson, who of course owned slaves. Awkward? You bet it was. And inscribed on this giant piece of cheese were Jefferson's own words, words that reflected Leland's dedication to the idea of the right of conscience. "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." Y'all, that'll preach today. Are you hearing this? Look, what we need to do. We need someone in this church to make a big old piece of cheese with these words on it. We'll put this cheese on that chancel table, and we will do a full worship service dedicated to the piece of cheese. We will then take the cheese downstairs to the social hall. We'll get some crackers, some wine. This is clearly the best idea I have ever had at this church. But back to my original point. The Reverend John Leland, patriot, defender of the right of conscience, cheese enthusiast. He was a fascinating individual whose wisdom we would do well to heed today. In 1791, he delivered a sermon titled "The Right of Conscience Inalienable," in which he asks this question: does a man, upon entering into social compact, surrender his conscience to that society, to be controlled by the laws thereof? Leland answers his own question with an unequivocal no. He then offers several reasons to justify his answer. Every man must give an account of himself to God, preached Leland, and therefore every man ought to be at liberty to serve God in that way that he can best reconcile it to his conscience. If government can answer for individuals at the day of judgment, then let men be controlled by it in religious matters. But otherwise, let men be free. He also said, it would be sinful to surrender to man that which is to be kept sacred for God. A man's mind should be always open to conviction, and an honest man will receive that doctrine which appears the best demonstrated. And what is more common than for the best of men to change their minds? A man who never alters his mind is either very weak or very stubborn. How painful, then, must it be to an honest heart to be bound to observe the principles of his former belief after he is convinced of their imbecility. And this ever has and ever will be the case while the rights of conscience are considered alienable. Leland concludes with these words: finally, religion is a matter between God and individuals, not the objects of civil government, nor any way under its control. These are powerful words. But what happens when an individual holds a strong belief, religious or otherwise, in the rightness or wrongness of something that puts him or her at odds with the laws of the state? Does the right of conscience grant that individual the right, religiously, morally, or legally, to disobey or disregard such law? Tricky. As it relates to America, this gets into some rather complicated First Amendment jurisprudence, because we are now talking about the hallowed freedom of religion. What freedoms and accommodations are granted to individuals who claim a religious right or a right of conscience in the face of a civil and secular law? The late Reverend Dean M. Kelly was a Methodist minister, a legal scholar, and religious freedom advocate. In the last book he wrote before his death, there is a chapter entitled Rights of Conscience. In that chapter, he notes that appeals to the right of conscience, historically speaking, have been used by individuals in this country to excuse themselves from military service, saluting the flag, jury duty, paying into Social Security, union membership, vaccination, and blood transfusions. Kelly also notes the same right of conscience has been used by individuals in an attempt to justify illicit, or at least frowned upon, activities, including polygamy, Sabbath observances, snake handling, faith healing, the use of controlled substances, and the sheltering of persons deemed to be violators of law, such as runaway slaves or illegal aliens. In the days and times we find ourselves in, this church may soon face a day when we will need to make more than just a hypothetical decision about whether to exercise our collective right of conscience in order to engage in one of the activities I just listed from Reverend Kelly. Obviously, I'm talking about snake handling. Look, if we're being open and honest, the majority of folks in this congregation, not everyone, but the majority of folks here lean left politically. So around here, exercising the right of conscience sure sounds wonderful so long as we're talking about using it as a justification, say, to avoid military service in a time of war, or to offer sanctuary to undocumented human beings. But what about when appeals to the right of conscience are made by those on the right? Employers or pharmacists who don't want to be compelled to offer birth control to their employees or customers because of deeply and sincerely held religious beliefs. Citizens who don't want their tax dollars to fund abortions. As Sharon mentioned, business owners in Jacksonville who don't want to serve people who identify as LGBT or Q because they sincerely believe the Bible tells them not to do so. The right of conscience is a double-edged sword. In order to be consistent, we must either accept everyone's claim to the right of conscience, which is completely unenforceable and would lead to absolute chaos, let's be honest about that, or we need to find some necessarily sophisticated way to fairly and equitably justify some uses of the right of conscience while prohibiting other uses. In other words, if I'm choosing to be cynical, we need to figure out how to justify our applications of the right of conscience while prohibiting their uses of the same right. I mean, deep down, that's what all of us, whether we're on the left or right, really want. To justify ourselves in our own eyes while making the other side look clearly wrong. Why am I so cynical this morning? To do this, especially if we're going to try to do it in good faith, we have to balance the needs of the individual or the few against the needs of the many. This is the countervailing interest represented in our fifth principle by the term democratic process. Democracy literally means rule by the people. It inherently suggests that the needs and the rights of the many, the people collectively, outweigh the needs and the rights of the few or the one. Taken to an extreme, this idea can completely eviscerate the right of conscience, just as the right of conscience, taken to an extreme, can unravel any civil society based on democratic values. So balance. In the context of today's sermon, I'd like to point out a few things about democracy. First, democracy is a huge part of our history, especially as Unitarians. The Unitarians were the descendants of the Puritans, and the Puritans brought a radical form of democracy, radical for its day at least, to the shores of America in the 17th century. The Puritans, you'll recall, broke away from the Church of England, itself having broken away from the Roman Catholic Church. In a reductionist nutshell, one of the main points of contention between the Puritans and the Church of England, and also the Roman Catholic Church, had to do with polity. Who should have power, and what should the structure of that power look like? The Puritans, like others who emerged from the Protestant Reformation, had a revolutionary idea that every person could hear the voice of God for themselves, and therefore did not need the mediation of a priest, bishop, or pope. Now, because of this, the Puritans supported a bottom-up kind of polity as opposed to a top-down hierarchy. As such, instead of receiving an appointed priest or bishop from on high, Puritan churches voted for their ministers, voted for their own congregational leaders. This was unheard of at the time. And this Puritan model of democracy substantially influenced those who would later design the shape and structure of what would soon become the United States of America. That tradition of early, admittedly imperfect democracy is still evident in the polity of every Unitarian Universalist congregation, including our own. And it is part of the reason why this church has over 500 committees. Look, it's messy and it's inefficient, But as UUs, we are called by our faith to believe that there are far more important and sacred things in this world than mere efficiency. If all you care about is efficiency and bottom lines, then maybe Unitarian Universalism isn't for you. Maybe church in general isn't for you. But as I stated earlier, democracy run amok can lead to terrible outcomes. Tyranny of the majority, as John Adams coined it back in 1788. And our founding fathers took steps to structure a government that would guard against such tyranny. We have to remember that democracy means far more than simply voting. Voting is part of a democratic system, but it is not necessarily the sine qua non. I and Sharon mentioned earlier today the Jacksonville HRO, Human Rights Ordinance. For those who were there for the final debate at City Hall last month, you may recall a back and forth that occurred between some of the council members. I may be misremembering the exact formulation of this discussion, but my recollection of it went something like this. In considering the merits of having the issue of LGBTQ protections go to a citywide referendum, that is, a direct vote of the citizenry, as opposed to a vote by the council, one council member observed that if America had depended upon such a direct vote of the people on the question of slavery, we would still have slaves in this country today. I've been chewing on that observation for some time. There is a part of me that wants to believe that that city councilman was wrong, but the larger part of me believes that he was right. If there had been no Civil War, would the citizens of each of the southern states have eventually voted to outlaw slavery? And recall that slaves would not be eligible to participate in such a vote, meaning their fate would have depended entirely on the votes of white Southerners. And if you think that citizens in each state would have eventually voted to outlaw slavery, and maybe they would have, exactly what year would that have happened? I honestly don't know. But the longer I think about it, the bigger the knot in my stomach becomes, and the more painful the ache in my heart becomes. Democracy is not a simple matter of voting and winner takes all. The needs and the rights of individuals and minorities must, of course, be protected. The right of conscience must be given space, but exactly where and how to draw those lines is fuzzy. As I grapple with these issues, I have to come to take the view that democracy, rule of the people, only exists in truth when all the people are equitably granted the freedom to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And any attempt by a majority to strip from any other group of human beings the rights of life, liberty, or equal opportunity to pursue happiness, any such attempt is an attack on democracy itself and incompatible with our values as Unitarian Universalists. A true democracy must be one in which there is equal justice for all, equal freedom for all. If that is our operational definition, then we must painfully conclude that America has never truly been a democracy. We aspire to it. Perhaps we only give lip service to it. But if America is to become a true democracy, it lies in our future, not in our past. And any attempts to move forward by looking backwards must be resisted by people of conscience, hopefully people like us. The history of this country is inextricably intertwined with the history of our faith. I cannot help but believe that our respective futures, our destinies, are similarly connected. I believe that, few in number though we are, Unitarian Universalists will play a significant role in the future of this nation. For better or worse, the values of our faith help to build this nation. And so it may be that the values of our faith will help to ultimately redeem it. But if that is to be the case, then we must all move together in concert with one another. We must lend our hearts, our minds, our bodies. We must ply our thoughts and prayers and actions to incarnate liberty and justice for all, to recognize such justice and liberty as the inalienable birthright of every child of creation. May it be so, and blessed be.